This is about a larger systemic change about the kind of system we operate in.
I believe that this is the moment that we need democracy more than ever.
We need more people of all types of backgrounds to step up and offer their expertise to solve the challenges in each of our communities.
Let's do what we know to be the right thing and be true to that inner voice. I didn't ask to be treated differently, but I'm going to take it on because I have a job to do and nothing's going to get in my way of doing that.
Go get yourself a political home. You know, Vote Run Lead would love to be that home. Black Voters Matter would love to be that home for you.
Thank you for your support. Thank you for leading and running as you are. And I have your back.
Welcome to episode 3 of Your Kitchen Cabinet, Who Belongs? I'm Erin Velarde, founder and CEO of Vote Run Lead, and I'm so glad to have you back with us, folks who are joining us, and so many of you that are asking new folks to come on. We really appreciate the effort to push it out. And so we are halfway through our 6 weeks, and this is, you know, next slide, please, Marilena. Just like some of the other conversations we've had, we're going to have several experts with us today to go through. Paku will welcome, of course, you and frame the conversation. Eric Foner will discuss the treatment of Blacks during the Reconstruction era. Karen and Kathy have an amazing presentation and actually work together to really craft. There's a lot of really good information in their presentation around the meaning of citizenship from the late 1800s all the way up to modern times. And then throughout, like I said, we'll pepper you with the citizenship questions, and then we'll close. Some folks are able to stay on for some conversation after, but some folks will have to hop off as well of our cabinet members. So thank you to Eric, Karen, and Kathy for joining us. Next slide, please. So like weeks prior, we are talking and tackling really tough conversations about our history. Some of it can be offensive, some of it has been harmful. And so we want to provide a trigger warning. We want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and prioritizing yourself. If you need to go off camera, if you need to, raise a red flag. Last week, I think we had some really beautiful sharing happening in the chat. And so I want to thank those of you who did share some really personal stories about your experiences, the experiences of your parents, that not only sort of bring color to what we're talking about, but, really can share how it is still living with us today, right? That the history and the choices we have made very much show up in our everyday lives. Next slide. And so we're good about this. I think for our speakers, we're going to be asking the questions in the chat box. You don't have to wait till the end to ask questions. I'm tracking them. So if Eric, who's not going to be using slides today, if you hear something, go ahead and just drop it in the chat if you want clarification, and I'll make sure I get to it and share it up with our speakers. Being respectful, trying to stay on time, and of course staying muted when we are in the group conversation. So, all right. And then finally, we have been building this, what we're calling a living document. And so you can send the information to info@VoteRunLead if you think of it after, but you all have been wonderful about contributing in the chat. So many good resources. Last week was a real richness of resources, and we hope the same will happen as you continue to share articles and books in the chat, and we've been putting those together in a living document on our website. And then, we want to flag that, vocabulary matters, and we're learning alongside all of you. If we're not saying something correctly, if we are not using the right terminology or something outdated, or there's a better word or a better spelling of something that you think we should be using, please also share that with us and with your fellow Vote Run leaders. All right. So no further ado, I will turn it over to my friend and genius, Chief Program Officer Paku Hang of Vote Run Lead.
Thank you, Erin. Hi, everyone. Good morning to our friends on the West Coast, and for folks in Midwest and East Coast, good afternoon. Like Erin said, my name is Paku Hang, and I'm the Chief Program Officer with Vote Run Lead. And like Erin said, this is the 3rd week of our 6-week series on Your Kitchen Cabinet. Radical leaders that are going to uncover the past so that we can have a democracy that we all deserve. And in the next hour, we're going to be talking about who belongs, and specifically about American citizenship. And this is actually a topic that's really important to me because I was actually born in a refugee camp. And when I was 15 days old, my mom and my dad and my older sister and I came to the United States. And I can remember growing up and being in the 2nd or 3rd grade, and my mom and my dad forcing me to quiz them I thought at the time, like, these really stupid questions about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and thinking, like, why are we doing this? And then I remember a couple weeks later, my parents having me dress up, and we went to Milwaukee. We were living in Wisconsin at the time, and we drove to Milwaukee, and we took this really nice picture with this man in a black robe, and my parents were really excited. I think I actually fell asleep, but it was the oath ceremony where my parents and my sister and I were naturalized. And at that time, I didn't understand it, but my mom, by passing the citizenship test, she allowed my sister and I to become citizens of one of the most powerful country in the world. And that is what we're going to talk about today. Like, what does citizenship mean? Who is allowed to become a citizen in the United States? How does it occur? And what happens when our government leaders decide to choose racism over the rule of law, or over the law of eligibility? And so in order to frame that conversation and dig into it, I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about where does citizenship show up in our Constitution. And actually the 14th Amendment gives us kind of the entryway into citizenship for this country. But specifically in the United States, there are 4 ways that you can become a citizen. You can become a citizen by blood, right? And this is basically means that if you had at least one parent who was already a citizen of the United States, then you could become a citizen when you're born. You can become a citizen by birthplace or soil. And this basically means that if you were born on American soil, then you can become an American citizen, or you're automatically an American citizen. And then a 3rd way of becoming a citizen in this country is if you marry someone who's already a citizen. So you'll have to go through a process, but that is a pathway to citizenship. And then lastly, you can become a citizen if you become naturalized. And what that basically means is that you fulfill some of the eligibility requirement, and you've gone through the administrative process, and then there's a test you have to take. And just like what we said earlier in this program, it's a test that includes 10 questions. They're open-ended, and you have to correctly answer at least 6 of the 10 questions. And then you pass, and then you take an oath, and then you can become a naturalized citizen. Next slide, please. But this is an issue that has been contested from the very beginning, and it's meant different things for different people in this country. And so we're going to start off by actually doing I think I'm going to ask a question. And so we're going to actually have our first speaker talk about what this has mean for African Americans, Black people, right after they got their citizenship after the Civil War.
Okay, is that my introduction there?
Let me give you a proper introduction, Eric.
No, I don't care about that. I'm happy to start talking.
All right. I just want to share that you're the DeWitt Clinton Professor of Emeritus at History at Columbia University. He's one of only 2 persons to serve as president of 3 major professional organizations: the Organization of American Historians, the American Historical Association, and the Society of American Historians. And he's only one of a few people to have won the Bancroft and Pulitzer Prizes in the same year. And already, Eric, someone in the chat box has said how excited they are that she has been citing your book for some time. So now, without further ado, go ahead, Eric.
Okay, I'm very happy to be here and join this panel and speak to this important group. So I will briefly talk about citizenship and particularly its relationship to African Americans in our history. It's very complicated, as we just heard a little bit. The Constitution, to begin with, refers to citizens in a number of places, but it never, at least before the Civil War, describes who actually is a citizen. It says the president must be a natural-born citizen. That's why Henry Kissinger couldn't be president, for example. But so that suggests you become a citizen by birth, as we were just hearing. But what about most of the Black population at the time of the Revolution and Constitution were slaves? They were not citizens. What about free Black people? That was up for grabs, contested. The first Naturalization Act about how you become a citizen if you immigrate from abroad, which is passed really in 1790, basically says you can do that if you're a white person. Non-white people cannot be naturalized in the early republic. They can come to the United States, but never become citizens. So there's a racial element as well as this notion of birth, et cetera, et cetera. And that balance between those shifted in the period before the Civil War. But basically what happens is African Americans fall further and further away, I'm talking about free people, from being considered citizens. Most states, by the time of the Civil War, do not treat free African Americans within their state as being citizens. Some do. Massachusetts does. A few others. Most states do not. And in 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court said no black person can be a citizen of the United States. Citizenship is just for white people. That was the law of the land when the Civil War broke out. But the Civil War led to this dramatic change in the whole definition of citizenship. Early on, actually, in 1862, just a year and a half into the war, the Attorney General, Edward Bates, issued a ruling saying, you know, the Supreme Court was wrong in Dred Scott. The Supreme Court was wrong. Free black people born in the United States are citizens by birthright. And black people can be citizens just like white people if they're born in the United States. Now, that was just the opinion of the Attorney General, but it represented the growing importance of the issue of slavery and what would happen afterwards in the war. But what really put black citizenship on the agenda was the fact that in the last 2 years of the Civil War, something like 200,000 African-American men served in the Union Army and the Navy. By fighting and dying to preserve the nation, they staked this claim to citizenship. Before the Civil War, free African Americans had often demanded citizenship. They held meetings, conferences, and they called them conventions of colored citizens. They claimed the status of citizen, which the country was at that time denying them. But as a result of the end of slavery and the service of black soldiers, the question of black citizenship was now on the political agenda in the era of what we call Reconstruction, right after the Civil War. And very quickly, Congress, in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and then very quickly after that in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, put this principle of birthright citizenship into the laws and Constitution. Any person born in the United States is automatically a citizen of the United States, with the exception of some Native Americans. It's kind of vague exactly which ones, but certainly Native Americans living on reservations at that time were considered citizens of their own tribal sovereignty, the Cherokee Nation or the Choctaw Nation. But the vast majority of people born in the US, regardless of race, regardless of national origin, regardless of religion, etc., were now deemed to be citizens of the United States. This principle of birthright citizenship is quite unusual today. We still have that principle in our Constitution. Certainly no country in Europe today recognizes automatic birthright citizenship. But we do. In Latin America, they do. A majority of the countries in the world don't. You can be born there and still not automatically a citizen. But anyway, in Reconstruction, we not only saw this definition of citizenship, but a great expansion of the rights of citizens. The 14th Amendment talks about the privileges or immunities of citizens, that states can't deny them. It talks about the equal protection of the law that states must give to all persons, not even citizens, everybody in the country, whether they're citizens or not, this equal protection. It's important to stop for 1 minute with that word protection, because they were talking both about access to the law, the courts, but also physical protection. There was violence against African Americans, former slaves in the South. Police forces were assaulting freed African Americans. There's nothing new about black people being murdered by the police. And the 14th Amendment was meant, among other things, to enable Congress to put a stop to that. But the problem is, yes, now African Americans are citizens, And then the Naturalization Act was amended in 1870 to allow African American immigrants to become naturalized citizens. That left people from Asia without a path to naturalization for a long time. But now blacks from other countries could become citizens just through the naturalization process. But there have always been many people who rejected the idea of black citizenship. President Andrew Johnson, one of the two most racist presidents in American history, I'd have to say, rejected the Civil Rights Act. It passed over his veto. And he said, black people are not capable of exercising the rights of citizenship. They know nothing about the institutions of this society, even though African Americans have been here for hundreds of years. And he said, black citizenship is just impossible. Congress disagreed. The states at this point disagreed. African Americans then, men, gained the right to vote. Reconstruction became a major moment of interracial democracy in America, really unique in our history. But it was overthrown, and the long period of what we call Jim Crow was fastened upon the South. So African Americans were still citizens, but they lost most of their citizenship rights with the acquiescence of the North, of the Supreme Court. These constitutional amendments of Reconstruction were sort of abrogated during the long Jim Crow period from about 1890 into the era of the Civil Rights Movement. I'm going to stop because I've gone to my 7 minutes I was allotted, but just to say one thing. The debate over who is a citizen or who should be a citizen, as you all know, is still going on in this country, not only at the southern border about what happens to people who are trying to get into the country, but, you know, our current president first became a political figure by, you know, spearheading the argument that President Obama is not a citizen. And those of us who are, he was born in Africa, supposedly, he's not an American citizen. And so those of us who are historians heard in that campaign the echo of Andrew Johnson, the echo of the Dred Scott decision, the echo of the long, long history where citizenship and race were intimately connected with each other. So citizenship is still a contested idea in the year 2020. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you so much, Professor Foner. And I feel like, you know, what you're saying, it's such a paradox that this country can have such a radical notion of birthright citizenship, right? And at the same time, that racial element from the very beginning was there, you know, and it's such a paradox.
We do actually have a question from Mary. Eric, if you think that birthright citizenship is under threat?
It is definitely under threat. Particularly for, you know, the focal point of the debate right now is children whose mothers are in the United States but are undocumented immigrants, and the child is born in the United States. President Trump a couple of years ago said that he could just abrogate that by executive order. He said those children born to undocumented immigrant women should not be considered citizens because their mother is not a citizen. But that is a total misreading of the Constitution. The status of the parents have nothing to do with it. I always say in my lectures, if Bonnie and Clyde, remember them, if they had a child, the child's a citizen even though the parents are bank robbers, right? The crime, if it is a crime of coming into the country of the parent, does not pass on to the child. But certainly this notion of birthright citizenship is under attack. Senator Lindsey Graham at one point said he wanted to hold congressional hearings about amending the 14th Amendment to get rid of it. So we have to, one of the things this whole 7-minute history I gave proves is we have to be very vigilant about our rights, because rights can be gained and rights can also be taken away. That's the story of our history.
Do we have any other questions?
We do. We have a question about DACA or the pathways to citizenship, and any ideas you have about resolution.
You know, I'm not a member of Congress or anything like that. I think there certainly should be a pathway to citizenship for the DACA people who were brought here as youths. You know, this is a funny country. I'm in New York City, so the contradiction is very dramatic here. We grow up in New York with the phrase, "We are a nation of immigrants." We have the Statue of Liberty in our harbor. People are always, in New York, when people say, "Where are you from?" they're talking about some other country, not just having moved from, you know, Ohio to Michigan or something. And yet, we still have these debates about who should be a citizen and who shouldn't. So, you know, the DACA people deserve, they've been here, they've contributed to the society, they deserve to become citizens like any other immigrant into the United States. And, you know, let's hope that does happen in the next administration.
One more question, Eric, around just your understanding and your reactions to the government saying that same-sex couples that have foreign-born children through surrogacy, that those children aren't citizens.
Say that again, same-sex couples
that have their, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, there was a case where there was a same-sex couple and they used a surrogate, I believe it was from India, and they brought the child over, and then they found out that this child couldn't be a citizen, even though, you know, that first term where, you know, citizen by your parents, but because the biological parent wasn't one of these American citizens, then the courts were saying, well, this child could be.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a law professor. I can't comment on the specifics of that case. It does seem the general tendency now in the society is toward recognition of same-sex marriage, transgender rights. The Supreme Court recently made a ruling on that. So it seems like that particular decision is a little bit out of sync with the way cultural values are going right now. So, you know, I can't comment on what will happen in another case. And certainly the current Supreme Court is iffy when it comes to people's rights, let's put it that way. But if this is a couple, recognized as a couple, their child should have the same right to become a citizen as the child of any other couple. We have marriage equality in the law now, and this should be part of it.
Professor Foner, I think you make such a good point, and I'm going to connect this to the next speaker. I think you make such a good point in your question and your answer, because we often rely on our courts to make these rulings and to define kind of like what are our values. And yet, throughout history, our courts have not always sided on like what the average person would think about. And I'm thinking specifically of this case back in the early 1920s. There was an immigrant, his name was Bhagat Singh Thind, and he actually came to the United States back in 1913. He came to study in college, and then while he was here, he was very patriotic. He joined the military. He even fought for the US in World War I. And back in I believe it was 1918, he decided, I want to try the process. I want to become an American citizen. And actually in 1918, he was granted citizenship by Washington State. But then 4 days later, they rescinded his citizenship because they said that he wasn't eligible. Because at that time in America, you could become a citizen only if you were a free white person, or you were aliens of African nativity and persons of African descent. And what Mr. Thind was arguing that, hey, I am a white person because actually Indians, he was from India, Indians and Europeans share a common descent that was from, I think it's called the Proto-Indo-European line. And so he was saying, like, technically I am Aryan. And in 1923, the Supreme Court ruled that actually Mr. Thind could not get his citizenship because he wasn't white in the common sense. And so I think, just like you were saying, Professor Foner, throughout history, not only has like the issue of citizenship been contested, but also in and out, it's changed who can become a citizen. And the courts have not always voted according to, I think, the spirit of what maybe the original idea of birthright citizenship or the original idea of the 14th Amendment.
Right. Let me just say one quick thing. I mean, that's a very good point. But, you know, the Thind case also shows the absurdity of the concept of race, which we use all the time, but it has no scientific basis. The court said thinned is not white because your average man in the street looking at him would not think he's white. What kind of definition is that? You know, either legally or scientifically, it's all in the minds of people, who's black, who's white. And yeah, that's why race is such a pernicious idea, because it sort of tries to make real something that actually has no real existence.
Thank you so much, Eric. I so enjoyed your comments, and I want us to move on actually to the next speaker. But before doing so, I wanted to see if we could do another citizenship test. So the question is, who did the United States fight in World War II? This is going to be a polling question. Is that right, Mark? And so we're going to put that up in a poll, and you can choose the answer, and we can see. So go ahead if you see it. It's Citizenship Quiz 2, who did the United States fight in World War II? Feel free to answer that. And then submit your answer. And we'll see if how many of us got that question right. Can we see the results, Mark? So the right answer is Japan, Germany, and Italy. And I think this is a really good, and
right. 66 for those of us listening in, 66% of us got it right. Now remember, you only get really, 4 wrong on the open-ended questions, and we actually chose all of the open-ended questions. So you would have had to written that in. These are not multiple choice on the citizenship test.
Exactly.
Right.
Thank you, Mark. So I think this is a great segue actually into our next speaker, who I know Aaron's going to introduce, but I just wanted to say that this issue of race is really prevalent when we do talk about citizenship. And for me, I'm especially thoughtful of really this question is about folks who are not white and not Christian, right? The citizenship issue is really prevalent for folks like us and not folks that are white and Christian. And unfortunately, in our American history, there has been many times where our government leaders have chosen racism over actually the rule of law or the law. And our next couple of speakers will speak to a really horrific incident in our history. So I'll hand it over to Aaron.
Yes, I want to introduce our second speaker, who I also said in 15 years of collecting bios and headshots has the absolute best headshot. So thank you, Karen. I'm really rethinking headshots now. Karen Ishizuka is a 3rd-generation Japanese American. She specializes in Japanese American and Asian Pacific American history and culture. She has the fantastic job of currently being the chief curator of the Japanese American National Museum based in LA. And her latest book is called Serve the People: Making Asian America in the 60s. That was in 2016, which is on the PEN America's list of writers' recommended books of protest. And we will drop that book in the chat for you to read as well. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin. Yeah, before we get to this slide, let me just say thank you for having me. Thank you, Eric, for that great introduction. I think one of the things that I'd like to do is to expand that discussion of race and specifically citizenship to Asian Americans. I think, because Asian Americans started immigrating to the US in the late 1800s, we have been here since for 3 or 4 generations, 5 generations, but we came right in right after Reconstruction, right during the Jim Crow laws, and there were several laws then during Jim Crow that really reinforced anti-Asian sentiment and then reinforced that racial hierarchy. So Eric mentioned the 1870 Naturalization Act, which allowed naturalization to persons of African descent, but it denied the right to all other non-whites and particularly Asians. So, hence, unlike European immigrants, Asians had the moniker of aliens ineligible for citizenship. And that really narrowed the definition of what an American is to black and white. So Asians and other people of color not only were outside the discussion of the impact of race, but also the outside of who is actually an American. Were really seen as sort of perpetual foreigners. So the next slide, Maria Elena. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was the first act to specifically ban a specific nationality from immigration. And if you remember, Trump touted this as sort of the precedent for the Muslim ban. Also, Chinese were required to carry ID certificates or face deportation, which also has echoed through the current past. And it was only repealed in 1943 with the Magnuson Act that then allowed 105 Chinese per year. It also set the stage for further immigration once the supply of cheap labor from Chinese was excluded. Then there was a definite attempt to bring in other people who would fill that labor shortage of cheap labor. So the next slide. This is one of the acts that came forth during that time, the 1913 Alien Land Act, and it banned aliens ineligible for citizenship for owning land. So, here you have that combination of sort of legislative racism and the economic basis. So that's really important. The California began the Alien Land Act in 1913. It passed another one in 1920, but eventually 15 states followed that had an anti-Alien Land Act. Then the law remained on the books in California, at least, until 1956. And then, after that, there were just a lot of other laws, the anti-miscegenation laws prohibited interracial marriage, and that was passed by most states. And that really basically began after the Civil War, and it remained on the books, though, until about 1956. So it was a state issue. And now we're again looking at state issues versus federal laws. So although it was proposed many times, there was no federal legislation against mixed marriages. The next act is the 1924 Immigration Act. And you can see this headline looks very much like recent headlines. Talking about immigration, president, ban. It basically banned all immigrants from Japan. And it also passed a national origins quota of 2% per nationality as of the 1890 census. So this, even the Department of State, the Office of the Historian, even they had indicated that in all of its parts, the most basic purpose of the 1924 Immigration Act was to preserve the ideal of US homogeneity. So, even though it was illegal for Japanese to immigrate after 1924, that of course didn't necessarily stop everyone. My husband's father basically jumped ship. He was asked to put up a $200 bond when they landed in San Francisco to ensure that he returned after being docked. But he decided to give up that bond. He already had his brother who had before walked into the country from Mexico, and they left. So that's how they got into the country. So when we talk about illegal immigrants, even, people think of the model minority of Asian Americans being so model for other races, specifically Blacks and African Americans and Mexican Americans to follow. But we have had to resort to other means necessary also to come into this country. Next slide. This leads us to, the second main time when citizenship was overruled by racism. And I know Kathy will get into this more, but I wanted to bring this to the attention of you all. It says, and if you can read it there, that all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, will be evacuated. So what is a non-alien? A non-alien, is a citizen, but it would be difficult for them to say, all citizens, 2/3 of you Japanese Americans are citizens by birth, still have to be excluded, forced from their home, and sent to concentration camps for the duration of the war. So, at this time, I'd like to just point out just the use of euphemisms as well. We have non-alien, which is kind of a no-brainer. They also talked about the forced exclusion being an evacuation, like we're presently being evacuated from floods or fire areas. They talked about the concentration camps being relocation centers, and in some cases, actually, pioneer centers, they called them. And along with that, I just need to differentiate the terms of internment and incarceration, that they are actually two separate but parallel systems of incarceration, of detention. And I think that the term internment is often used also by Japanese Americans, but also used in a mitigating way as well to indicate that it was simply internment and really not a concentration camp. But it really behooves us to understand that the internment was really a legal process of the treatment of nationals at which the US was at war. And it was conformed to the Geneva Convention. So Japanese, as well as German and Italian nationals who were considered enemy aliens were arrested and held in internment camps run by the Justice Department. And all told, there were about 8,000 to 10,000, and mostly Issei men, immigrants who could not become citizens. And then the relocation, as they called it, the concentration camps were run by a separate organization, the War Relocation Authority. And it detained initially 110,000 and eventually 120,000 Japanese American men, women, and children. Again, 2/3 of them were US citizens by birth. There was no sense of due process of law. So it is something that really we need to take to heart, that the failure of democracy, really affects all of us. If it could happen to one group, then it could happen and is happening to subsequent groups afterwards. So the next slide. So the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act, the Japanese were finally granted naturalization after they had lived most of their lives in the US, 50 to 60 years. I think at that point, many didn't bother to learn those 10 questions and become naturalized citizens. After all, they've been living and working, paying taxes, being part of the US landscape for 50, 60 years. And it just added a small quota from Japan. So I just wanted to point this out, that this was a painting by Henry Sugimoto, who was an artist who was incarcerated. He did this in 1953, and you could tell that throughout his life, you can see George Washington, the flag, etc. You can see the very old lady with her cane and the sort of iconic heart over the hand over the heart. But it just, it really is something, it comes from the Japanese American National Museum and part of our collection and part of his vast collection. But it shows basically how, Americans, how American citizenship is vastly fluid and vastly imperiled. And on that, I'm going to stop and really go, and Kathy will continue, in terms of really talking about the impact of the war.
Thank you so much, Karen. I feel like you remind us that this notion of citizenship is so racialized, and we just can't get away from that. Erin, do we have any questions for Karen from the chat box?
We don't, but we, oh, there we go, great. So we would like a little bit of the repeat on the explanation between internment and incarceration, and the use of internment by some Japanese. But one of the questions we have is, can you speak a little bit more about reparations for the Japanese? I know Kathy's going to talk a little bit about that, and how that reflects on Black Americans. We could hold that question. And then I also have a question around, we set up the citizenship question prior to this around, who Americans fought in the war, but the only internment or incarceration was of the Japanese. And I'm also curious of what you know about some of those choices that were made, where the Italians per se were not given the same fate. So there's several questions in there.
Okay.
Kathy, I hope you can answer.
Okay. Internment, incarceration. Yeah, that's really important. When we talk about the internment, and let me give just a story on that as well to show how it has made a difference. Aiko Herzeg Yoshinaga, who is a Nisei who was interned herself, not interned, her father was interned in internment camps, and she was in a concentration camp. But she, there were, in the early 80s, 1980s, there's a commission on relocation and internment of civilians, and it was a government commission to determine whether a wrong was committed, and if so, what needs to be done. There were commission hearings all over the country. Aiko happened to be at several. One was in Washington, D.C., where she resided, and she heard a testimony from a woman who was basically denied, like there's so many who are Holocaust deniers as well. So she said it's an absolute lie that 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned during World War II. So technically, this was correct. 120,000 were not interned. 8,000 were interned. 120,000 were detained, incarcerated, whatever you want to call it. But to say that those were just say internment has really dire consequences, and that was one example. Let's see, reparations. Reparations, Kathy will go into that. Reparations was a huge grassroots level effort. It was, and it got into the courts, but it got back to the commission hearings, and then now with Black reparations, when the commission hearings first came and they talked about, let's have the government decide whether a wrong was committed. I think most of us in the community were saying, so what do they need? What else do they need to know to understand that?
Right.
But, you know, it turned out to be very, very important because we needed to go through that process of really educating the public in general, asking those questions, asking for people to come forth and talk about their own incarceration, the losses that they incurred. So, you know, now, you know, I think, you know, and it's my personal opinion, and, you know, we as Japanese Americans, you know, not only have a responsibility, you know, now to speak up for migrant detentions, but really to advocate for Black reparations. You know, as the only community who has gained reparations,
Right.
it is, I feel it is a responsibility. You know, the apology is one other big thing that happened with the commission hearings, and the government has already apologized for slavery. But, you know, in this country, you're fined. You know, you have fines, and it's monetary. That's based in that our system of justice, and many times has, you know, you have to put your money where your mouth is, and we do have to do something to push this forward. So, you know, I'm aware of the time here. Yeah. So thank you so much to talk about. Thank you.
And Karen isn't able to stay with us, but Kathy is, and so we're going to skip the next polling question so that we can get right into it. But one of the questions, Kathy, as you're talking, is also what happened to the children of, okay, you saw that in the chat. Great. All right. So I will, I'll give you a quick introduction. Kathy, you're the co-chair of, and hopefully I'm saying this right, Nikkei for Civil Rights and Redress, and you have an amazing presentation, and we'll get right to it.
Okay, I'm going to give some information about the World War II camps and the imprisonment of Japanese Americans, and the impact of on our community of how we were used in citizenship that really affected us for generations. So again, I am a Sansei third generation Japanese American born after the war, and like many Sansei, we did not know about our parents and our grandparents' incarceration. They did not tell us that 110,000, 120,000 Japanese Americans had been forced from the West Coast to 10 major camps. And so in the slide, you see the camps that were spread across mostly the western part of the United States, but some a little bit farther east. I didn't know that my mother and her family went to Gila River, Arizona, that my father's family was at Manzanar, California. I didn't know that they lost their market in Boyle Heights or their farm in Santa Maria. So Karen kind of explained, how did the government get away with incarcerating its own citizens? And she talked about the euphemisms. I think the euphemisms really covered up the real truth. And so, you know, they touted that, again, that Japanese Americans were being sent to relocate and start a new life in a pioneer land. Mainly, they didn't mention that these were indigenous lands that many of them were on. And as Karen noted, the really infamous use of the word non-aliens for citizens. When the FBI came for my grandfather, who was an Issei, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, many people thought that, well, the Issei weren't citizens, they were citizens of Japan. So maybe there was some legality to taking them, in spite of the fact that the state and the naval intelligence had found no trace or no threat from Japanese Americans to this country. So my grandfather was taken to Bismarck, North Dakota. And after a hearing, because of the Geneva Accords, he was allowed to join his family at Gila River, Arizona. But many of the others did not. They were transferred from detention center to detention center, from internment site at Missoula, Montana, for example, to Lordsburg and Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they did not see their families until the war ended in 1945. So you talk about family separation. That was family separation. And many of the people that were picked up, just as a side note, were Buddhist ministers. In fact, all of the Buddhist ministers were picked up. So again, the treating people because of a religion that's strange or different, just as today Muslims are perhaps strange or different, so too the Buddhists were treated in that same way. And the really infamous and horrible part is this last part, which is the government needed Japanese faces to exchange for American prisoners of war that had been caught behind enemy lines. And so they turned to the Japanese Americans. We have Japanese faces. So they convinced or coerced many of the Issei first generation that were in these internment centers to repatriate, to say, I will go back to Japan. And so what happened is that their families were forced to make a decision. And some of them, children were citizens, renounced their citizenship, and to keep the family together, agreed to go back to Japan. And there were actually two ships that made the journey around the world. Meeting in one place was near India, where the ships met, the Japanese ship and the US ship, and they exchanged prisoners of war. Now, this even goes further. Because they did not have enough Japanese Americans who wanted to repatriate, they turned to Latin America. And they looked for Japanese Latin Americans. And from 12 different countries, they gathered close to 2,000 or maybe over 2,000 Japanese Latin Americans, mostly from Peru, and brought them, kidnapped them basically from their countries and brought them to the United States and put them in a camp called Crystal City, which is near San Antonio, Texas, a couple of hours. Ultimately, 3,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese Latin Americans were exchanged. And the cruelest stab of all to the Japanese Latin Americans were that after they were brought here against their will, they were told at the end of the war, you are illegal aliens, you have to get out. And so many of them went to Japan, returned to Peru, some were able to stay here. Now, what was the impact on the second generation of this whole thing about citizenship? They were citizens, they were in shock and disbelief. And there were two main responses. One was, well, I am an American, I'm gonna do what this country wants me to do, I'll be a good American, and I will prove my loyalty. I will go to camp, I will volunteer to fight for this country, I will prove myself. The other view was, I'm an American and I have rights. I will challenge the curfew, I will challenge the evacuation, I will not enlist in this service or be drafted as long as I am behind barbed wire. Give me my rights back. So as a Sansei, I'm sorry, the next slide actually. As a Sansei, I believe that, you know, our activism of the 60s really arises out of that same spirit of saying, I am a citizen, I have rights, and we are going to speak up. And, you know, we are of course inspired a lot by the civil rights movement and the move for ethnic studies and Black Power, etc. But I do believe that I am inspired by people that you see here on this slide, the draft resistors, people like Gordon Hirabayashi, Min Yasui, and Fred Korematsu, and Mitsuo Endo, whose cases went to the Supreme Court. And you know, they fought for us and they stood up for us and they were a model for us later on, even though we didn't really learn about them too much later. I never questioned my citizenship. I questioned whether I questioned my identity. I didn't know if I fit in. I didn't know what it meant to be Japanese American. I didn't like being Japanese American and I wanted to be white. So for me, ethnic studies and that fight was much more impactful and meaningful. I didn't have a fear that my citizenship was in question at all. So we came back empowered after learning our identity and feeling quite, you know, like, you know, much stronger. We returned to our communities, we fought for redevelopment, and we started the campaign, next slide please, for redress and reparations. And I think Karen talked about this and the impact it had, but we knew what our rights were, we knew the processes, we learned how to push for a bill in Congress, we took people to Washington, DC, but we also implemented the idea that it takes a grassroots campaign. Not just lobbyists, not just legislators in a political office, but you have to have the community. You have to have the grassroots behind you. And, you know, so we lobbied, we mobilized the community, we built that education throughout the country. And we did education. 140 people, ordinary Japanese Americans, went to Washington, DC in 1987, spoke to Congress, and in 1988, we won redress. And today, I think the lesson, as Karen said, is that solidarity and support for others is key to what we learned during Redress. And we see so many parallels. We were moved off of our property and our land. Hopi Navajo were moved off of their land, and their lands were contaminated. We supported them during the Redress campaign. We also supported the anti-apartheid movement. And afterwards, you know, in terms of 9/11, we did feel a very immediate connection to the scapegoating and the threats to the Muslims, and have built a solidarity with that community, along with the immigrants today who are, you know, who are being picked up by ICE and transferred from detention center to detention center. And I just want to say that I'm not really sure what citizenship means actually, because it could be so easily disregarded. And I think it's a question that I have in my mind. And I just want to share one story, because there was a woman who, a Nikkei woman, second generation, who at a press conference when we won Redress, pulled out a piece of paper. She said, "I've carried this piece of paper with me all these years since I was in camp." And the piece of paper was her birth certificate. It showed that she was born in the United States and therefore a citizen. And she said, "Now I don't have to carry this with me anymore." At the time, it was very moving. But when I think about it now, it was like that piece of paper meant nothing. It meant nothing at the time because they were put into camps. And I question even now what that means. Maybe it's really a privilege because I have citizenship, and so I took it for granted, or I take it for granted. But in a lot of ways, we don't really have the decision making over how it's used, how it's seen. And I think one thing that Asian Americans, we see ourselves often as the other, as the foreigner. I don't see myself that way. We are seen as the other, as the foreigner, as you see with COVID. Immediately, it's like the Chinese flu, you brought it over. Well, I don't know how I brought it over. I'm born here, raised here, but yet it's immediately shifts to a race issue, and we are now seen as the other. I firmly do not see myself as the other or as a foreigner, but that is the view that's promoted by the leaders and by other people. I'll end there because I know time is short.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And as you were talking, I'm just reminded of how much we have not learned in our history books about this period in our country and what happened to our Japanese American brothers and sisters. Aaron, do we have any questions from the chat box for Kathy?
Kathy, you're using the word ise, and we have some questions about the origin of that, what that word means.
Yeah, okay. For us, generations are really important. Issei is first generation, born in Japan, who came to this country. So they didn't have citizenships. Nisei is second generation, my parents. Sansei is third generation, that's me. And my children are fourth generation, and my grandsons are fifth generation. And I didn't answer the question about what happened to people that were married to non-Japanese. If you had, I believe it was 1/16 Japanese blood, you were sent to camp. If you were an orphan and Japanese, you're taken from the orphanages and put into camp. If you, your spouses had a choice, if they were not Japanese, to go with you or not. And many of them went to camp with their husbands or wives who were Japanese.
Thank you.
It's so inhuman. You know, it's so dehumanizing.
Yeah, yes. And I wanted to reiterate the point about Black reparations. I belong to organizations that fully endorse and support the movement for Black reparations. We believe that whatever form it takes, it's not for us to decide, but we as Japanese Americans support the movement for Black reparations. It needs to be decided by the by Blacks, what, exactly the content, the form, etc. And I know that all of that is being discussed.
Yeah. Thank you. So I know that we've come to the end, and I know Erin has some announcements she's going to make, but I just wanted to thank Professor Foner, Eric, and Karen, and Kathy for helping us dive into this conversation about citizenship and how it's an idea that's been contested from the very beginning, and yet it continues to affect us nowadays. And I think for many of the folks who are on this call who are currently running for public office or one day aspire to run for public office, I think this is really for us not only a reminder, but a reckoning of what type of leaders we want to be. And when we're in those positions of power, what type of decisions we should make. Because in many of these incidents, Eric and Karen and Kathy were alluding to incidents where our leaders, in my opinion, made the wrong decision. So with that, I want to thank again, Eric and Karen and Kathy for your wonderful contribution.